members of the University Board, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this public meeting of the Senate of the University of Groningen. This afternoon, we are attending the inaugural lecture of Professor Weir, appointed Professor of History of Christianity and Modern Culture at the Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies. An inaugural lecture commemorates the newly appointed professor's official acceptance of the chair. Preceding the lecture, a colleague of the newly appointed professor is asked to introduce the professor by means of a laudation, offering us a glimpse of the professor's life and career. I call upon Professor Molendijk, Professor of History of Christianity at the Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies, to introduce our new colleague and ask Professor Weir to subsequently present his inaugural lecture.
Mr. Rector Magnificus, members of the board, dear colleagues, honored guests. The long list of Todd Weir's fellowships, grants and awards begins with a striking item. It's a fellowship from the Airlift Gratitude Foundation in Berlin. The Stiftung Luftbrückendank was originally set up to financially support the families of the 78 men who lost their lives in the airlift during the blockade of West Berlin, which started in 1948. Nowadays, the foundation funds a variety of projects, such as Todd Study in Berlin. The connection with Germany is a leitmotif in Todd Weir's life and work. He was born in Germany, in Bavaria. The family then moved to the United States, where Todd was raised in Seattle. He did a Bachelor in Development Studies at Brown University. Brown also offered an exchange program, which in 1988 took Todd to the University of Rostock. This was a turning point in his life. On Facebook, Todd writes, "The fact that I became an historian is in itself a product of historical coincidence. A semester abroad program at Brown University dropped me in East Germany in the last year of the Cold War. To my surprise, the state became defunct soon after my departure. Another coincidence, I would say." Todd goes on, "This experience motivated me to retrain as an historian, which I did at the Humboldt University in Berlin." Unquote. However, this formative experience as an exchange student in East Germany took some time to materialize. First, Todd had various jobs in San Francisco. He set up an arts exchange with Czech artists and produced cultural festivals. But in 1993, Todd returned to Germany and obtained his master's degree at the Humboldt University in 1998. His professors there were Ludolf Herbst and Hans August Winkler, the author of a highly acclaimed history of modern Germany with the telling title, The Long Road West. After this experience with German Wissenschaft, Todd went back to the United States to complete his PhD thesis at Columbia University. In New York, he also met his partner, Anna Salzano. Their work took them to Berlin, then to Seattle, and eventually Belfast and Munich. Son Sasha and daughter Martha were born in Europe. Prior to their coming to Groningen, Todd had a position at Queen's University in Belfast, whereas Anna was working in Munich. Somehow they managed, but still I was glad to hear that Anna found a job here at the University Medical Center. Todd's assignment at our faculty is the history of Christianity and modern culture. He directs the Center for Religion and Heritage and coordinates the new Master's Program of Religion and Cultural Heritage. Todd is not only an international renowned scholar, but also active in the region. He gives talks in local village churches, for instance, claiming, I quote, "What happens in the north of the Netherlands can be a sort of torch for the rest of Europe." Apparently, Todd is adapting quickly to his new position here. Todd's research has focused on various aspects of the interaction between Christianity and secularism. He wrote a major study on secularism and religion in 19th-century Germany for Cambridge University Press. In 2016, this monograph won the Jacques Barzun Prize for the best book on cultural history. This prestigious prize is awarded annually by the American Philosophical Society, the oldest academic society in the United States, which since 1900 has counted more than 250 Nobel Prize winners among its members. Todd is now writing a transnational history of the term worldview, or Weltanschauung. How did the term worldview develop in the clash between secularists and Christians over the past 2 centuries? In a recent TEDx talk, Todd has challenged us to rethink our assumptions about worldview, one of the key concepts in today's thinking about politics and religion. I'm sure he will challenge his audience this afternoon too, and I'm looking forward to his inaugural address in the splendid hall of our great university.
So I'd like to thank you, Ari, for that wonderful laudatio. They say that a measure of sanity is being able to create a coherent biography, a coherent narrative of your life. So if I'm ever feeling unstable, I will just replay the recording that we're making today. So thank you all, friends, colleagues, students, the Rector Magnificus, for the opportunity to speak to you today. I would just say that 2 things made me nervous prior to coming here. One was that everyone kept asking me, "Are you nervous?" And the other one was that people said, "Do you have some jokes prepared?" And I don't, so I apologize right away. When I first came here 3 years ago, I was walking through the library of the faculty, and I was struck by the display cases containing indigenous sacred objects collected by the former professor of religious history, Theo van Baren. Many of you will be familiar with these cases. The glass here separates the nominally secular sphere of scholarship from the objects of religious inquiry. And at the dawn of the, this for me symbolizes the 20th century scholarly gaze upon religion. At the dawn of the 21st century, Talal Asad published an essay entitled, "What Might an Anthropology of the Secular Look Like?" And I've sort of taken this as the something of the title for my own talk. With this question, he asked people to reverse the gaze and to interrogate instead what had previously not been considered, namely the secular position of the observer, as we see here. And his proposal was that we consider both the secular and the religious together, under the assumption that the secular and the religious had co-produced each other in modernity. And I think that this approach, this co-investigation of both of these terms, actually animates many of us in this room and is perhaps the paradigm for the study of contemporary religion in the 21st century. Now, how can this approach be applied in the field of European history of religion? Some have argued that the secular was produced out of European Christianity, and they've placed it at the end stage of a long line of supersession, from Jewish to Catholic, Catholic to Protestant, Protestant to now secular. Others have suggested that the secular has come to provide the background or the immanent frame in which religion is now situated. I want to propose another location for investigation, and I take as a starting point the fact that for 2 centuries now, we've had a coexistence of the secular and religious as far as the movements of secularism are concerned. And based on this observation, I want to ask today what a joint history of Christianity and secularism might look like. How, in other words, do we put both religion and the secular in the same frame of analysis? And I think it's a question easily posed, but rather difficult to operationalize. And I want to try to do this with my chair in the history of Christianity and modern culture. That's essentially the approach I want to take. And today I will sketch out for you a few of the ways that I approach this in research. So I will, we have the quote from Talal Asad. What I'll first do is I will go through some examples of research. First, past research, and then spend most of the time today talking about my current research on worldview. And then I want to discuss the relevance of this research for contemporary developments in politics and religious studies. And then finally, I will ask what this approach to thinking about religion and the secular can mean for the study of heritage. So, secularism has two competing meanings. In the 19th century, it was a name given to movements that favored the exclusion of religion from the public sphere and the advocacy of scientific worldviews. In the 20th century, it came to mean the separation of church and state, so it became more of a term we associate with governance than with social movements. The work that I undertook in the book that you see here was more on the social movements that were called secularism. And I was interested in the origin of secularism within the frame of Christianity. And my argument was that unbelief, which is something largely considered external to religion, was in fact a type of quasi-confession in its social form. So what does this mean? During the 19th century, there was a reconfessionalization of German society. And this was produced by the competition of religious communities, and it led to a pillarization of society, or as you call it in Dutch, verzauling. The state also contributed to this process by allocating or taking away rights from members of religious communities, with Jews and dissidents being at the bottom. In this system, organized secularism developed attributes similar to those of other religions. It invented rituals, structured milieus, and fought for access to education in schools. Yet, the question remains, did secularists really constitute a confession, or even a quasi-confession? Now, certainly free thinkers were not very numerous. There were only ever a handful of them. They can't be compared to Catholics or Protestants. But my argument is that the importance of these groups is that they're symptomatic of larger social movements. And I'll give you as an example of this, our very own Aletta Jacobs, the famous daughter of the University of Groningen, who is constantly brought back to our memory. Now, she is known as a physician and birth control pioneer. She was a pacifist. She was also a women's rights activist. And we could ask what role religion had in her story, in her biography. Now, people, of course, point out that she was Jewish by origin. Yet I had an intuition when I looked at her biography, and I thought, I bet she was also a free thinker. So I went to Google, as one does, entered her name, free thought, and indeed, it turns out she was a board member of the main free thought association of the Netherlands, de Dageraad. Now, why is her membership in this tiny organization significant? My argument is that one cannot understand these other social movements, feminism, pacifism, also things such as eugenics, popular science. They don't make sense unless we understand that secularism formed a confessional cornerstone for these movements. So certainly there were liberal Protestants in these movements and liberal Catholics as well, but the thread that goes through all of them is secularism. And if Jacobs had been a generation older, I would have also Googled socialism and in her case, because in the 20th century, secularism became increasingly tied to socialism and the socialist movement. And I've nearly completed a book on this subject entitled Secularism and Socialism in Germany, and I'm investigating these as overlapping cultures. So I'm trying to argue that political ideologies do not map on exactly onto a position such as secularism, but they're really two cultural forces that are intermingling and interacting in 20th century history. Now, for the thesis of the Fourth Confession, my argument in the previous book was that secularism is a type of Fourth Confession. I chose Fourth Confession because I'm really arguing that it has an impact on Catholicism and Protestantism, which are both thought of as proper confessions, but also on Judaism. I'm trying to show that the interaction of these various confessions, they all helped shape one another. This is certainly the case for the position of German Jews. Jews and free-thinking dissidents in the 19th century suffered from similar forms of discrimination. They could not easily become professors, judges, or military officers. Thus, Jewish emancipation and secularism became linked in the minds of many Germans in the 19th century. And my work has been taken up in Jewish studies because it helps explain why anti-Semites consistently argued that opposing Jewish emancipation was absolutely crucial to retaining the Christian nature of society, but moreover, protecting it from godlessness. So that does not make sense, that argument, unless you see that in the minds of anti-Semites, Jews and atheists were linked. And in fact, there's a structural basis for that opinion. Now, but what about the impact of secularism on the larger confessions, Protestantism and Catholicism? Did secularism actually help shape the history of modern Christianity? That's a question I have to answer. And I do have answers in my past book, but I want to focus instead this question on my contemporary research, which I'm undertaking now in Groningen. I'm now working on a design for a monograph on worldview, a transnational history of worldview. And what I will do is follow the translations of this term from German Weltanschauung into worldview in English, and even Wereldbeschouwing in Dutch. And an interesting variation in Dutch is that the Dutch prefer the term Levensbeschouwing over Weltanschauung, and that is a sort of a variation that is worth comparing to other European situations. So, as I will discuss in a moment, we are today awash in talk about worldview in English. We find it in popular politics, contemporary theology, and also in religious studies. Now, it's, I think, very attractive to embrace this term and to use it ourselves. But before we do this, I think it's important to look at its historical baggage. Otherwise, if we assume terms that are readily available and attractive, it may be without examining them that we end up allowing them to use us. And I use conceptual history as my key method for this investigation. And conceptual history is available as a critical tool for also examining contemporary categories. The term Weltanschauung was coined by a philosopher, Immanuel Kant, in 1790. But my argument is that its history was driven forward not by developments in philosophy or science principally. Rather, it became a keyword in German in the 1840s, and it was much talked about in the Netherlands around 1900, and it's today very popular in the United States because it is always involved in clashes over religion. And these can collectively be called modern culture wars. Each chapter of the book I plan will look at the usage of the term worldview in a different camp in these culture wars. And today I'm just going to follow three of these camps. I'll look briefly at secularists, Christians, and liberals. Worldview burst into the German public sphere in the run-up to the Revolution of 1848. It was initially dominated by groups that could be identified as secularist. One of these groups were science popularizers. The great naturalist Alexander von Humboldt, whose picture you see here, published a book in 1845 called Cosmos. And what he attempted to do was to write a single natural history of the world and of the heavens, and put it all into a thin volume. And his claim there was that it was possible now, through science, to write a total description of the world. And this he called Weltanschauung. So he made Weltanschauung this sort of pinnacle of the natural sciences, mixed with a good dose of aesthetic romanticism. Now, Weltanschauung was also mobilized by religious actors at this time, and particularly by followers of theological rationalism. This was a Enlightenment-derived theological movement that believed that it was important to bring Christian teachings in line with modern science and historical discoveries. Rationalists had been tolerated within the major religions up until the 1840s, but it came to a rupture in the 1840s, and the radical rationalists were driven out of the churches. One of these was the Protestant minister Eduard Balzer, who declared around 1846 that what divided his group of rationalists from the Orthodox who remained in the church was no longer a difference of faith, it was rather a difference of worldview, and that's why he mobilized the term. Whereas the old worldview of Christianity had seen God as separate from the world, the new worldview recognized no transcendent sphere. And we also see the operation of worldview in religious politics and in politics more generally. Here we see the Catholic rationalist and revolutionary Robert Blum at his execution on the barricades of Vienna in 1848. And you'll see here that he's waving off the priest, and he's facing death with his eyes open, as if to say, I have no need of your God, I have my own worldview. So he was an adherent of this. Within the space of a decade, by the 1860s, many of these radical Christians had declared that they were abandoning theology in favor of what they called a unified natural scientific worldview. So by the 1870s, worldview became this common term in German public life, and new meanings began to proliferate. There was a Nietzschean worldview, a Wagnerian worldview, you name it, there could be a worldview of it. Now, one could easily get lost chasing all of these stray balls, but I stick to the main camps of the culture wars. That's the principle that I follow to find the main strands of the use of worldview. So the next one that I want to look at is Christian worldview. The idea of Christian worldview is perhaps one of the most important developments in 20th century Reformed theology, and in particular, its evangelical and fundamentalist North American branches. If you search Amazon Books, you will find hundreds of titles using this term, and I put a few of them up on the screen. Thus, there's an interesting reversal that's taken place. Whereas secularists dominated the term worldview in the 19th century, today it's advocates of Christian worldview who have gotten the upper hand. How did this reversal take place? And more interestingly, did secularists contribute in some way to Christian worldview? I argue that they did, and I look for the explanation in the dynamics of apologetics. So church apologetics means defense of the faith generally, but a lot more goes on in the act of apologetics. And ideas are exchanged, they're imitated, they're inverted. And I'm trying to explore apologetics as a methodological tool in writing intellectual history. And it's with this in mind that I'm publishing a book, edited book with Hugh MacLeod, the church historian, on apologetics and politics in the 20th century. Now, there were two essential approaches to apologetics in 19th century Protestant theology. The liberal model was one of dialogue. It was championed by Friedrich Schleiermacher, who proposed that modern theology should consist of a dialogue or enter into a dialogue with between the Christian Bible, Protestant tradition, and science. And he called this mediation theology, or that was what his followers called it. The second approach was that of theological conservatives, and they viewed the apologetic encounter as a war between Christianity and secularism. They rejected Schleiermacher's mediation theology because they thought that Schleiermacher was sacrificing key elements of the Christian faith. And yet it was the conservatives, rather than the liberals, who embraced the term worldview, and they knowingly borrowed it from the arsenal of their enemies. Now, what did conservative Christians find so appealing in the idea of worldview? And to look at this, I want to turn to James Orr. He was a Scottish Presbyterian, And in 1893, he told his readers that they should learn about worldview by studying their enemies. And he made this argument. He said, the opposition which Christianity has to encounter is no longer an opposition of detail, but of principle. The circumstances necessitates an equal extension of the line of defense. So he sees a turning point in modernism at this time, that Christianity cannot be defended piecemeal, that rather there has to be a defense of the entire edifice of Christianity. And he writes, it is the Christian view of things as a whole which is attacked, and it is by the exposition and vindication of the Christian view that the attack can be most successfully met. So what does this mean? Or recognize that the secularists had crystallized knowledge into a single system from a single vantage point. Okay, at least that's the claim of worldview. And he saw worldview as a powerful weapon that the enemies of Christianity could use to unify their attack, their operations. So he wanted Christians to learn from this that they had to unify their faith and to present it as a rational, integrated system. And just as the secularists had tied their knowledge system to a series of institutions, Christians should match these institutions one-to-one as in a battle line. So very clearly, the apologetics was thought of as a study in military strategy. Now, the man who did most to link worldview to the creation of Christian institutions, and he created a university, a newspaper, and a political party, was a Dutch admirer of Orr, Abraham Kuyper. Together, Orr and Kuyper had a great influence in the United States. Kuyper delivered his famous Stone Lectures in Princeton, New Jersey, which was the home of American Presbyterian theology and also, to a certain extent, of American fundamentalism. Kuyper's lectures in 1898 were called Calvinism as Life System. And by life system, he meant as a metaphor for worldview. So that was a very influential presentation to the American public. Orr went on to become the author in the pamphlet series, The Fundamentals. And it's this pamphlet series that gives us the term fundamentalism in the US context. Following the Scopes monkey trial in 1925, the fundamentalist movement reformulated itself in the United States. Carl Henry was the editor of Christianity Today, and he presented a strategic vision in 1947 for a global evangelical campaign which would take advantage of US global dominance. And it's quite interesting quotation because there are at least 3 synonyms for worldview that come up in this quotation. If historic Christianity is again to compete as a vital world ideology, it must offer a formula for a new world mind with spiritual ends, involving evangelical affirmations in political, economic, sociological, and educational realms, local and international. The redemptive message has implications for all of life. A truncated life results from a truncated message. So again, the connection is established here between the unabridged total worldview of Christianity and also the strategic thinking about a complete apologetic strategy with all of the institutions of modern life. And fundamentalists have said about founding universities in the United States since that time. Worldview also provided important epistemological arguments for Reformed theology. Cornelius van Til, a Dutch-American theologian, told apologists not to argue with atheists over the facts of the Bible. Instead, they should argue that the facts appear differently to adherents of different worldviews. So facts appear differently to adherents of different worldviews. Each approached the world with different presuppositions, and hence they would never agree on what constituted ultimate reality. And this viewpoint was popularized in the United States in evangelical circles among apologists. And we see it here in this cartoon. So the atheist says, you biblical creationists are so biased when you look at evidence. You should try being more objective like me. And the implication here, of course, is that what's really crucial are the lenses through which people view the world, the worldview. So that effectively the argument is there is no such thing as objective knowledge. It depends entirely on the perspective with which one approaches knowledge. One should not underestimate, I think, the impact of these type of philosophical arguments about presuppositionalism in contemporary American culture wars. Terms that might seem silly, such as alternate facts or post-truth, but they actually make sense if you adhere to an epistemology of worldviews. Now, the other great discursive strand of worldview talk was developed by liberals. It differed dramatically from the secularist or the Christian use of worldview in that it was a critique. So in other words, whereas secularists and Christians wanted people to build their identity around worldview, liberals said they should build the identity around resisting worldview. Already in the 1870s, prominent scientists in Germany had begun to argue that this dream of a unified natural scientific worldview was intellectually bankrupt. Rather than being a summation of scientific explanation, such as von Humboldt wanted it to be, worldview was just an expression of opinion, an expression of value. Now, the timing of this critique was important. Liberals had been happy enough with worldview as long as it was directed against the Catholic Church and against conservative Protestants. But in the 1870s, worldview was being associated with socialism. The political stakes were made clear a generation later by the sociologist Max Weber. In a famous speech of 1919, he told Munich University students to avoid worldview at all costs. He urged them to look at the existing worldview parties of the day. And the Catholic Center Party and the Social Democratic Party were parties that actually embraced the idea of political worldview. So he said, look at these parties. What's the connection between worldview and power? It's inverted. Worldview is a compensation for lack of power. Worldview is connected to being a minority party. And in fact, these parties were ineffectual precisely because they adhered to worldview. In order to govern rationally and speak for the whole nation rather than just themselves, liberals would have to do with as little worldview as possible, said Weber. Weber died the following year, and most of the students did not actually heed his advice. By the end of the Weimar Republic, most had become followers of the man who successfully turned nationalism and racism into a worldview, and that was Adolf Hitler. So Hitler always spoke of what he was doing as a Weltanschauung. He never spoke of philosophy or ideology or even, well, maybe faith, he might have used that. But Weltanschauung was a key term for the Nazis. But we don't have time to go into that today. The liberal critique had a second chance at the end of the next war. Concerned about the rising threat of communism, a transatlantic group of liberals gained the backing of the CIA, and they formed the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And here we see one of their demonstrations in Europe in the late 40s. Their project was to wean European intellectuals from fascism and communism. And they did this through many journals that they founded and paid for. In an inversion of Marx's famous dictum, religion is the opium of the people, the French sociologist Raymond Aron called these ideologies the opium of the intellectuals. Or, as he put it in the subtitle of the German version of his book, the addiction to Weltanschauung. At their conferences across Europe in the 1950s, Aron and his associates began to predict the dawning of an age in which total ideologies would become defunct. This became known as the end of ideology debate. In his 1960 book, the American sociologist Daniel Bell made clear that the group defined total ideology not in the Marxist sense as a set of ideas in service of class interests, but rather he described it as, quote, an all-encompassing system of comprehensive reality. It is a set of beliefs infused with passion and seeks to transform the whole of a way of life. It is, in this sense, a secular religion. So in other words, when they say ideology, what they really mean is worldview, I believe. And I'm going to investigate more carefully the relationship of those terms. So for the liberals, what's the alternative to worldview? At this time, it was philosophical pragmatism and political pluralism. So pragmatism opposes overarching systems and seeks truth in a piecemeal fashion, according to what works locally. Pluralism prioritizes the process of debate over the final goal. So it's more important that people are debating rather than they reach the truth. To go back to Aron, he translated this perspective into a political stance. He wrote, "I do not believe in the validity of a system comparable to that of the communists. I feel detached from the preferences or Weltanschauung of the left or the right. According to the circumstances, I am in agreement or disagreement with any given movement or a given party." So this is Weber's ideal of liberalism in action. Rather than basing decisions on a rigid ethical framework, on a true belief system, Aron proposed that people should take action locally and in a very pragmatic fashion. So let me sum up my points on worldview. Worldview gained currency as a category that allowed for a separation within religious consciousness in which warring camps could form around the churches on one side and secularism on the other. These camps used the term worldview to sharpen their differences. However, they also remained tied to one another in their competition over the term. The Christian worldview measured itself against the unified natural scientific worldview of the secularists. And even the liberal critique, which created an external viewpoint on worldview, was itself driven by partisan considerations. Now, what I find interesting is that we see that worldview is a term that is connected to the polarization of these secular religious forces, but at the same time, they are elaborating together a secular religious concept, so that the history of the term, taken over the long term, is actually a joint production of secular and religious actors. In that sense, it's quite a post-secular concept. Now, what is the relevance of this research for today's world? I'll show you a graph of the use of the term worldview in English publications since the Second World War relative to other words. As you can see, there's been a rush to worldview. What the research has to offer, I think, is a deeper understanding of the forces that are at work, also in the current popularization of worldview. Now, the skyrocketing use of the term worldview, and I encourage you actually from this point on to reflect when you listen to the news, just to realize how often this term comes up, at least in the English context. Now, the use of it makes sense in the post-Cold War political climate. It is readily available to people who diagnose a culture war or a clash of civilizations, because the fundamental premise of the use of the term worldview is that there is an unbridgeable gulf between worldviews. So worldview suggests that we are doomed to further polarization because our foundational premises are simply fundamentally different. Now, my research shows that the idea of incommensurability was, in fact, a strategy of apologists. Saying people can't understand one another is a very useful strategy if you're engaged in fighting culture wars. For example, you can use the epistemological claims of worldview to argue that multiple truth systems mean that we need multiple school systems. And this sounds absurd perhaps in Europe, but in the United States, we currently have a Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, whose husband said that parents need to have the right to send their children to a school that, quote, reflects their worldview. And Betsy DeVos is trying to dismantle the public school system as a unified school system for all Americans. You can also use the term worldview, of course, from a left-wing perspective, perhaps, to argue that indigenous peoples need to have their autonomy defended against Western cultural domination. Let's look at an opposite and somewhat, quite an opposite development in worldview, and namely the use of worldview is also appearing when people want to say there's an equivalency between humanism and religion. Recently, there was a commission in the UK that proposed that religious education in schools needs to be reformulated to include religion and worldviews. This move has been supported in religious studies by scholars who want to create a new basis for understanding religion that includes also secular positions. Nuns, for example, not N-U-N-S, but N-O-N-E-S. Andre Drochers and Ann Taves are two religious studies scholars who have proposed that we should go even further and that we should replace religious studies with worldview studies. So we should try that out on the colleagues. Maybe we can rename the faculty Worldview Studies. It's Faculty of Worldview Studies. Now, I don't deny that the advocates of worldview studies may provide new analytical perspectives that are useful, but I find their proposals strangely reminiscent of 19th century secularist arguments that everyone has a worldview, and if you're going to bother to have a worldview, you should preferably have an immanent one rooted in the sciences. Historical reflection is needed if scholars are going to adapt as an analytical term this very popular term of worldview. And it's popular and it's attractive. Why? Because it's been loaded with meaning through 2 centuries of culture wars. But people, I think, are not aware of that. So the final subject that I want to address today is religious heritage. I'm the director of our Center for Religion and Heritage, which has brought me into a very exciting field for a historian, and it's allowed me to work with some great colleagues in the faculty, but also with societal partners in Groningen and nationally. What is the connection between heritage and the work that I'm doing on worldview? Now, I would say that both worldview and religious heritage are products of the interaction of Christianity and the secular. It's very clear in the way that heritage is currently being mobilized by politicians opposed to Muslim immigration. Populists in particular like to portray themselves as latter-day crusaders against Islam and its threat to Europe. But what's quite interesting, if you look closely at the populist rhetoric, they often don't stick with the term Christianity at all, but they make the argument explicitly in terms of Christian heritage or Judeo-Christian heritage. So that's interesting. Why do they resort to heritage? And I think it's because they can make religious arguments, so they can argue against a religion, Islam, from a secular perspective. And they can propose an alliance of humanism and Christianity by pointing to their past joint history, even if this joint history is one of conflict, of culture wars. And thus, I think that it's an important area for investigation for scholars of heritage. Now, I want to mention another facet of religious heritage that I think is more interesting and more uplifting. And this relates to the many medieval churches that dot the landscape of the province of Groningen. If you travel out of the city, you will find that every third town, if not every second, has a medieval church. And these churches have been controlled and used by local Protestants since the Reformation. Yet since the 1960s, their congregations have dwindled, and many are now passing into the hands of secular organizations, such as the Stichting Oude Groninger Kerken, which is our main heritage partner in the city. What we're witnessing in this transformation, I think, is one of the most significant shifts in the history of Dutch Christianity. So it's a very significant period that we're now in the history of Christianity. Yet there's more going on in the process of finding new uses for these old churches than simple secularization. Religious studies scholars tend to look for the future of European religion in spirituality, in the New Age, in conversion to Islam or Buddhism, or in the rise of Pentecostalism or evangelical Christianity. Yet I think there is great innovative religious potential in local Christian heritage. Historians are not supposed to make predictions, however. I believe that this question of church reuse is going to be one of the key areas for future religious development in Europe. And I describe what is happening, I think, in the villages as post-secular meaning making. And I call it post-secular because the meanings that are being created through heritage are neither purely Christian nor are they purely secular. As one church elder in Enrum told me, his congregation is leaving the church to meet the secular village, by which he meant that they were willing to leave behind evangelization of the village in order to engage in a dialogue with the secular members of their local community. But I think one should also add that the secular village is being invited back into the church, so they're coming into the church yard, so to speak, to meet the congregation, let's say, in front of the church. And presumably that there's a dialogue that's taking place, and this needs to be studied, that is neither purely Christian nor purely secular. So I want to just conclude by connecting the three key areas of research to my starting question. I've looked at confession and at worldview and at heritage. These are all areas in which Christianity and the secular have met and engaged in a conflictual dialogue over the past 2 centuries. Their joint history reveals that the secular is always a force at work inside of Christianity, and that Christianity has informed also modern secularism. So, with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the reception.